This webinar forms part of the National Evaluation and Learning Programme for the National Lottery Community Fund's Fulfilling Lives programme. And this morning's webinar will be focusing on closing down beneficiary support projects. So we've got a great lineup of speakers and I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. But first, I'm just going to run over a couple of the technical aspects of the WebEx platform. So firstly, you'll notice that your microphones are muted. This is just to make sure we get a good sound quality during the presentation. So once we get to the questions and discussion section, if you'd like to ask a question, please do just unmute your microphones yourself to ask them in person. On the lower hand side of the screen that you'll see there's a chat box function. So if you have any comments as we go through or have any questions but your microphone isn't working, then please just do pop it in there and we can ask it on your behalf. Unfortunately, if you've dialed in today, you won't be able to ask any questions in person. So if you have got anything that you'd like to ask or any questions afterwards, please do just drop me an email. So you should have had an email from me yesterday, but just for reference, my email address is b.collinson@sheffield.ac.uk. We'll be recording today's webinar and we'll make it available to you all later on. So if you wish to share it with colleagues afterwards, then please do so. And we encourage you to tweet about the session if you'd like to as well. So our Twitter handle is up on the screen now, and it's great to see so many of you popping comments in already to let us know where you're from. So I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today and making this opportunity possible. So to start us off this morning, we're going to hear from Chris Milner from CFE Research, and Chris is going to be giving an overview of closing down beneficiary support projects. And he'll share some of the learning and recommendations from the Fulfilling Lives partnerships. Following Chris, we'll hear from Claude Sertinoglu and Ange Broadbridge from Fulfilling Lives Newcastle and Gateshead, and they're going to be discussing the critical time intervention that they've run in Newcastle and Gateshead. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Christine Grover from the Rough Sleepers Initiative and Liaison and Diversion Mental Service in Birmingham. So with no further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Chris, if you give me a moment. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Now let's just see if I can change the slides. I don't know if I have the power yet, Beth.
You should do. So if you, it's the white toggle on the left-hand side.
Yeah, that's not letting me change to the next page, I'm afraid. Yeah, I'm still not able to change, but thank you. Shall I just tell you when I need to change slide?
Yeah, sure. I'll have a look at what's going on from my end.
Lovely. Okay, no worries. Well, I'll get started anyway. So thanks so much, Beth, for the introduction, and thanks for kicking off the webinar this morning. I now have permissions, which is fantastic, so I don't have to ask you to change the slide each time. Right. So yeah, morning everybody, and thanks everybody for coming today. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Chris. I'm a Senior Research Executive at CFE, which is the National Evaluator, and I've been working with the National Evaluation team for about 18 months now. So what I'm going to talk about today is the aim of this research, the report structure, and some key findings from the research. I just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to all of the partnerships and staff who took part in the research. They've given us an invaluable insight into the process of closing down beneficiary work, and this research wouldn't have been possible without their help. So thank you for that. So the purposes of this research is to fully understand the intricacies of closing down time-limited projects, specifically those involving direct work with beneficiaries within Fulfilling Lives. The aim is to pass this learning on to other Fulfilling Lives partnerships who are either going through the close down process or are nearing their end date. The report will also be useful for commissioners and funders wanting to understand more about the resources needed to effectively and thoughtfully close down time-limited projects. Now, we at CFE have carried out a number of theme studies of Fulfilling Lives work over recent years, and through some of the fieldwork we were doing for these studies, we noticed that there was a real appetite for learning more about the close down processes. One thing to stress here that this isn't really a how-to guide, as it were, but rather the report is meant to offer learnings and recommendations based on how fulfilling lives has preempted and addressed challenges associated with the closed down process. So just a quick overview of the data collection and reporting methods we used in this research then. So we began by interviewing staff at Liverpool Waves of Hope late last year. Liverpool's project ended before the rest of the partnerships, so we wanted to speak to them as their work was ending. Then in June this year, we spoke to 3 other partnerships who had been through the process of closing down beneficiary work. In total, we carried out 15 interviews, exploring different stakeholders' experiences of the closed down process, identifying any barriers and strategies for addressing these. Some of these were unique to the local area, some of them were shared with other partnerships, and the aim was to explore both. So we worked with the data, broke it down into 3 sections, which we now have in the report. These are internal planning and preparation, external preparation and systems change, and how partnerships have supported beneficiaries during a time which could be especially difficult for them. There were a couple of really eye-opening and informative pieces of work from partnerships in Newcastle and Gateshead and Birmingham, which we featured as case studies within the report. These are just 2 short boxed examples. These are the critical time intervention at Newcastle and Gateshead, which we'll be hearing a bit more about from Claude and Ange, and the continuation strategy in Birmingham, and the lead worker peer mentor program in Birmingham as well, which Christine Grover will be talking about in a little while. So let's get into the recommendations. So let's start with the first section of the report, exploring recommended internal planning and preparation. One of the most important actions that partnerships have made is starting planning early. And when I say early, I mean as early as possible, which in some cases as soon as the program starts. Starting planning early has helped partnerships anticipate the barriers which may arise when closing down beneficiary work. Now, to give you an idea of one partnership's planning timeline, here's a quote taken from the report. So you need 6 months to agree the exit strategy, to develop it, to agree it, and get it signed off. Then you need another 6 months to communicate that to people. We underestimated the amount of work that was needed around comms and messaging. So we'll feature a couple of more quotes throughout, as I think it's probably the best way to speak about these things. Okay. Starting planning early will also allow partnerships to reflect, as the partnership goes on what they might need to change about how they approach close down. Even though planning starts early, the plan will almost certainly change. Planning early will also reinforce the fact that even though work may have just begun, it will inevitably end. Planning also needs to be highly collaborative and include input from any partners involved in the delivery of the work, and really importantly, include lived experience. As the program progresses and more partners join the program and become more invested in your work, these new partners should also be included in the planning of closure. As the end date nears, it's inevitable that staff will move on to other jobs outside the partnership. This is another reason why partnerships say it's vital to plan early and gather staff's valuable insight before they leave. Partnerships stop taking new beneficiary referrals in the 9 to 12 months before the planned end of that arm of the program. These decisions were based on data, showing the average time beneficiaries spent under partnership support. Although planning was always in the back of everyone's minds, Fulfilling Lives partnerships really did start to ramp up their closure planning in the final 18 to 24 months. Now, beneficiary numbers don't just drop uniformly though, and definitely not in line with any staff departures. This means that there was sometimes a mismatch between the number of beneficiaries and staff members, and especially those in navigator roles. In this situation, case management is really important here. So what I mean by case management here is having processes in place where those working directly with beneficiaries are continuously reviewing beneficiaries' progress and monitoring their own caseload and updating managers and other relevant staff members on this. Case management is important throughout the life of a project, obviously, but it's especially important in the final months given the changes which are going on at that time. I'll speak about monitoring beneficiary progression in a little while, but in terms of staff reviewing their own caseload and passing on this information to managing staff, this is really important for identifying where there are any gaps in capacity and how resources can maybe be reallocated to address these. Realistically, reallocation of resources is only possible if the resources are available and there is the flexibility to change resourcing, and that's not really always possible. Partnerships have sometimes instead opted to try and manage the number of cases each frontline staff member has by supporting them to close down some cases quicker than previously planned. With staff levels changing all the time, especially towards the end of staff contracts, this can be a particularly difficult time for managing caseloads. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet for managing caseloads, and it would actually be really interesting to hear about anything that partnerships have done to manage this. Finally, then, another consideration with staffing. Whose job is it to coordinate all of this case management and reallocation of resources? When managers have got so much else on their plate, working towards legacy, systems change, communicating the impact they've had as a partnership, how do they make the time to coordinate their own staff alongside that? An idea was put forward that a dedicated staff member could be given the sole responsibility to coordinate the close down of beneficiary work. A consultant or an operational manager, for example, who has prior experience of doing this. Closing down a project is complex and especially difficult for someone who has worked on creating and building it for so long and, quite frankly, is already plenty busy enough. So maybe a specialist drafted in to help with this is exactly what's needed. So far, I've spoken about what partnerships have done to organise internally. But what have partnerships done to prepare the outside world of commissioners, policymakers, and services for the end of partnership support? This element of closure is really important. Fulfilling Lives has obviously had the resource to support those experiencing multiple disadvantage. And this opportunity might not happen again, so how can partnerships help other services? Well, firstly, we need to understand what support there is outside the partnership and to what extent it has the capacity to provide for those experiencing multiple disadvantage. For most locations, support for multiple disadvantage is unfortunately lacking and very rarely offers the level of support which Fulfilling Lives partnerships have offered. By understanding where there is a lack, an effort can be made to fill those gaps in some way. So often partnerships formed relationships with local voluntary organisations and made referrals to them where possible. Planning early also comes back in here then. Partnerships were planning with external services, agencies, and various partners early in the life of the partnership. This was partly to reinforce to external partners that the programme would close, but also partnerships found this is also a really important factor in ensuring that services were going to be ready for any change in their role when partnership work ended. If services or any other external partners knew about the close down early, they could think about what this meant for them and go to partnerships with questions or requests for support. Partnerships told us that it was vital to be in regular contact with local services and remind them about plans to close, especially as the date draws nearer. Stakeholders will be more receptive to contact at this time if they've been included in planning at some point, so building those relationships early is really useful. One partnership had some success doing this through group meetings with local agencies. DWP representatives attended this group's meetings and became invested to the extent where they've implemented policy changes based on the principles of psychologically informed environments. Multi-agency and locality meetings have also been really important tools for bringing stakeholders together. Fulfilling Lives partnerships have been the navigators of services, and once the partnership has gone, stakeholders need to be able to communicate with each other. Multi-agency meetings help stakeholders plan how they do this in the future. But how do you get those agencies to these meetings? Well, I'm going to use another interview quote here, as I can't put it better myself. So this is what an interviewee told us. So a lot of services were reluctant to take on the full responsibility of someone who was very challenging or chaotic on their own. But the more they realized that there were a lot of services involved, there was less reluctance, or they felt less responsible for that person. That pretty much epitomizes why multi-agency meetings are so important. It actually takes some pressure off services. If services still won't or can't attend these meetings, though, partnerships have made sure to take minutes and make them available to the relevant agencies. Now, fulfilling lives partnerships have developed really, really useful practices which have translated into successful support. If you can disseminate those successes amongst the right people, like commissioners and service managers, they'll hopefully eventually realise that they need to take heed. Wi-Fi and Birmingham Changes Futures together have both been able to secure additional funding to continue their work in some way. This has in part been due to their ability to evidence the efficacy of their practices. I think the key to making the right people listen is some luck, but also to shout often enough and so loud that they can't ignore it. One partnership told us that once other agencies fully realised Fulfilling Lives would no longer be available, they started to address it by providing funding and commissioning services to fill the gap that would be left. I've got another quote here that I'd like to use here. So, get your comms message absolutely on point. Almost flood the system with your comms message that you're shutting your workstream down to supporting beneficiaries, and be relentless with it. Be absolutely relentless in checking in with your system that they understand that you are shutting down partnership work. Now, if there's one thing you will take away from my talk today, is that communication is absolutely vital. Okay, so actually, we actually have an upcoming study on workforce development, but it's worth mentioning here that offering support to local services to level up their workforce on elements of their practice is really important. All partnerships offered workforce development in some way throughout their programme. So Newcastle and Gateshead have done PI training, Wi-Fi curated a complex needs training suite. Liverpool Ways of Hope actually ring-fenced budget to help services pay for their own multiple disadvantage training, and found that those services were more likely to take on beneficiaries. Workforce development doesn't have to be training, though, and Birmingham have recently put together a series of resources as part of their continuation strategy, and that includes blogs, podcasts, webinars, and a how-to guide. Again, Christine will be talking about this shortly, but it's a really important set of resources which will showcase best practice long after the partnership is gone. So let's move on to the third and final section of the report, which explores how Fulfilling Lives partnerships have supported beneficiaries through their transition. It's important to recognise that transition hasn't always been perfect, and external support just isn't there for beneficiaries. Some partnerships have really struggled to move beneficiaries on, but these recommendations from partnerships should hopefully help. So communication has come up time and again here, and we can't stress enough how important it is. The key to supporting beneficiaries is keeping them informed. If the transition of their support is communicated to them effectively and in a timely fashion, beneficiaries are then given the chance to mentally prepare for the transition and make their own plans if they want to. As with planning, tell beneficiaries early. Partnerships gave some beneficiaries lots of support, and they recognise that to pull that away with little notice just isn't fair. Partnerships wanted to make sure that they went into beneficiaries' final year of direct support with a plan for how they wanted to progress. These plans are based on individual preferences and were created alongside beneficiaries, not on their behalf. Some partnerships actually have a team dedicated to beneficiary progression, who partnerships meet with to talk about whether they want to go into education, training, and or employment. I spoke about multi-agency meetings earlier, and though it might not always be feasible for beneficiaries to attend these, or they may not want to, offering the option to go to a multi-agency meeting can be really helpful. If beneficiaries do take up that offer, it can then help them to be more involved in their ongoing care and support. So monitoring beneficiaries throughout closure. This is really important for making sure the right beneficiaries are being moved on at the right time. Now, this is useful for case management, but it's also important for the individual as well. Partnerships have used a number of strategies to support beneficiaries and monitor their transition. So this includes using strategic case reviews, medication reviews, care packages, red, amber, green ratings, and critical time intervention. Part of Fulfilling Lives' unique selling point has been that support is tailored to the individual, and the measures these frameworks provide actually help partnerships to individualize care. Two of the partnerships we spoke to for this research have actually continued their expert groups after direct beneficiary work has ended. If beneficiaries want to join an expert group, this is an excellent opportunity for them to build their own skills and confidence as part of their recovery. But it's also a great way for those expert groups to expand the work they're doing. And the insight beneficiaries bring to expert groups is really valuable to the group. Okay, that is actually pretty much everything I had time to chat to you about today. I hope the overview I've just given you has been useful, and it's given you an appetite to read the report if you haven't done already. And just finally, I just wanted to say thank you again for everyone involved in the research, especially the partnerships we spoke to who were really, really generous with their time and advice. Okay, I think I'm going to, so thanks so much for everybody coming today, and thank you for staying on and listening to our other speakers. I think I'm going to pass over on to Beth now, but if anybody has any questions, I think I saw a few popping up as I was chatting along there, then please feel free to go ahead with questions. Are you going to take over with curating the questions, Beth?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, the presentation after work. I'm experiencing a bit of background. Apologies that people struggled with the audio this morning. It seems as though WebEx has upgraded overnight, kind of thrown off a few things. Is it never
Not very well, I'm afraid, Beth.
Could you make me the host again?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, cool. So, can everybody hear me okay? I know we're struggling with Beth's audio, but can everyone can hear me okay? I can see a thumbs up from Robert, thank you. Okay, well, let's just start off with yes, fine, fantastic. Okay, did anybody have any questions that I could answer? Does anybody want to kind of go ahead with an initial question? Not a problem, that's fantastic.
I'm going to see.
Was there any in the chat that I missed?
Chris, I'm going to ask as little as possible. Could you have the presenting powers of the board, please? If you right-click on her name in the participant list.
Yes, I can. Hang on 1 second. Apologies. Bear with me. Okay, I'm passing over to you, Claude. Now you should have the presenter privileges in just a second. There we go. Okay. Are you able to move the presentation around, Claude? Perfect. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? Right, okay, so I will get started if everyone can hear me okay? Brilliant, okay. So we're here today from Newcastle Gateshead Fulfilling Lives. I'm Claude Settinoglu and I'm the System Change Lead for Fulfilling Lives Newcastle Gateshead. And later on in the presentation, I'm going to be joined by Ange Broadbridge, who's our Research and Evaluation Lead. And some of what I'm going to talk about with you today really chimes with what Chris has just been talking about with the overview of the research that CFE have been doing. And I'm going to talk through why endings matter and look at it from a local programme delivery perspective and what we sort of noted during our programme ending with our beneficiaries and what we'd like to share with you today. And if at any point the sound goes awry, just type in the chat box because that's running quite well for me. I've got really poorly internet at times, so I might end up sounding like a Dalek, so apologies. So me and Ange have been preparing the presentation for a wee while, and we thought, what do we want to share with learners today around, from a local perspective, what did ending the programme well look like for us? And I thought, let's go back to the beginning of why we decided to end our direct client work 2 years before our funding ends in March 2022. So it was decided that, you know, we really need to model to the system ending beneficiary work early, something around not creating dependency on a service and saying, actually, can we move our beneficiaries on into more independent way of living, looking at not relying on a service with 8 years of funding and saying to the system, this can be done. And we decided that by doing this, we'd look at introducing a new model, which was our critical time intervention pilot. Now, Andy's going to talk a wee bit more about that later on in the presentation. And what we asked of our system change practitioners, that they were going to move from a navigation position into system change practitioner roles and pivot between two ways of working, and that was navigation, working with really chaotic, vulnerable beneficiaries, then working with some of our more stable beneficiaries who would be able to access the critical time intervention pilot and move on independently. Now, we wanted to talk to you about how we did this well and what challenges we faced doing this, because I think Chris has touched upon this during his initial presentation, in that if we're going to end this well, we've got to sort of acknowledge that this is going to be quite complex. And we've highlighted in our presentation at the start here some of the challenges that we faced in adding to that complexity. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so for the last 2 years, what were our main focuses on ending this well? And, you know, what we decided as a leadership team and working with our system change practitioners in the wider Fulfilling Lives team is that we had to be clear and consistent with why we were ending our frontline work and what that meant for our beneficiaries. And we talked that through with the consistency to be able to give a really clear and authentic message to our beneficiaries. So, you know, there wasn't a confusion of like, will I be working with post-March 2020? And creating that kind of dependency on the service was something that we were really keen on trying to model back to the system, saying this isn't going to work if we create a dependency on a service. Actually, we're going to try and move people on well, and we're going to try and plan it so that people understand why we're moving them on. And we talked to our staff with training around this and looking at, you know, why by 2020 we were going to say no more beneficiary work. And I think with that, what we had to allow for was we had to have a great degree of flexibility within our action planning when we were ending things well, and allowing for a wee bit of that contingency planning, saying it is going to come to an end, but we need to keep assessing what this end is going to look like by March 2020, because staff will leave, people will move on, clients might move from a RAG system whereby they're doing really well, and then suddenly they go back into another model way of working whereby they're not looking at the CTI model anymore, but we're having to work with people that are more chaotic and more vulnerable. So how do we start assessing that ending things well and making sure that we readjust that action plan and making sure that our staff understand that readjustment and they're part of that co-design of the readjustment, but also keep feeding that back into the system and making sure the system around us understands that when we're readjusting our action planning of ending things well, they are part of that as well. Because there was always that worry that, 2 years is quite a long way away, but before you know it, it comes around really quickly, and you don't want to be in that position as the programme where it feels like you might be falling off a bit of a cliff edge with trying to end things really well for your beneficiaries, your staff and the wider system. So it's looking at how do you keep checking in with all the people that are so integral to this action planning and say, this is why we're changing it, this is why we're doing it, and keep being consistent with that message, but also allowing a wee degree of flexibility. Me and Andrew were talking about this the other day around what does that degree of flexibility look like, and I would cap it about 30–40%. You need your action plan to sort of be able to move as your landscape changes around you, because what we found that if you're quite rigid with the planning, taking a hit really does impact quality of service. So when me and Andrew were looking at preparing this, we thought, over the last 2 years, how have things ended, and how do we make sure that when you're ending things, you're maintaining quality and reputation of the programme, and allowing for a degree of flexibility within the action planning of ending things well will ensure that you're looking at quality ways of ending things for people, and also going to the system and saying, like, we might be ending things and ending the direct client work, but we're still really good at doing that, because we know that when you're ending things, especially with vulnerable beneficiaries, a whole host of worry can come up that you might not have seen for a year of working with that person, and that worry can then transfer into the system. And I think Chris did touch upon this, where services will revert back to, but we don't know what we're doing. I don't think we've got the capacity to deal with this. So a crucial part of our ending things well is that we maintained and we're absolutely embedded in conversations with our system in saying, this is what we know about this person, this is about the risk of managing this person, and how can we help you do this well for Fulfilling Life, shutting down this person by March 2020. And also something that's very close to my heart, because I work very closely with the EbE Network, is that we said there was a what next for some of our beneficiaries who were coming to the end of their time with Fulfilling Lives. And we gave a real viable pathway to some of our beneficiaries, saying, yeah, you can join our Experts by Experience network if you feel you're ready to do that. And that can become a space for you to sort of work through your recovery even more by getting your voice heard about some of the changes that you want to make in the system. Some of our beneficiaries and system change practitioners did take that on. Some of our beneficiaries didn't, but we wanted to make that EbE network as absolutely viable and as plausible as a pathway to move on to as possible. And that included introducing training and workforce development offers to our experts, and making sure that they knew where the welcome meetings were, and we could have times where we were engaging with the community of our beneficiaries. And we saw an increase in numbers, moving from about 6 people within the network. We've roughly got about 20–25 people now joining who are part of our EbE network. So moving on to the next slide. So challenges, we're going to get them in an ending, and I think they become more palpable as you are ending things, because at the back of your mind, endings can be tricky, they can be complicated, and they bring up a lot of feelings for staff, for beneficiaries, and also the wider system, which, you know, Chris and I have just touched upon. And I think it's asking yourself the question, if we face challenges, how is this going to compromise our programme quality? And what can we do to minimise the compromise to programme quality? And what is it that we have within our toolkit as a programme, as a team, and also what does the system have to enable us to ensure quality? And I think with that, it's consistency, and it's making sure that the comms messages that you're getting out there to the system remain absolutely on track of being, you know, relentless in what you're giving over to the system of why you're shutting things down, and being consistent with that. And 2 things to consider within your planning when you're looking at ending things off. Staff will move on. You know, staff have lives outside of work, and we have to be really understanding that people have mortgages to pay. People need to know that there's going to be a bit more security in a job. So how do we ensure that when staff are leaving, we've got resource within a team to look after the people and the beneficiaries that are still on programme? And who's going to step up to be able to look after the cases that we still have within the programme that need closing down well. And, you know, the system, preparing the wider system for closure, it's nature. The system's going to revert back to what it knows when working with vulnerable adults that have a whole host of complex needs. They'll revert back to say, we probably can't work with this person because you've been working with them, so there's nothing else we can really do. And I think this is our point as a programme and as a national initiative to say, well, how can we help you work with this person, and can we share some of our learning with you? And that's where maybe our workforce development offer would come in from Fulfilling Lives Newcastle and Gateshead, where we talk about working with complex needs. But there will be a wee bit of resistance in the system of saying, I don't think this is for us because you've been doing that, so there's no, where else can that person go? So I think it's about being tenacious as a programme and say, well, actually, this person still needs support. We've done so much, and we can identify that this person will still have risks and the protective factors of minimising. So this is where we see you working with this person. And be kind with that message and understand that endings, as I said at the start and throughout this, endings are really complicated and they can throw up such a host of feelings. So part of our role in the last 6 months of delivering this ending was working in multidisciplinary meetings saying this is where we think you can take this person and this is how we know you could work with this person. This is all our learning around this person. But also keep talking to your system change practitioners, keep talking to your beneficiaries around what the plans are so they feel absolutely integral to that move on plan. And last from me, something that really came into the fore during the last 6 months of our operational work with beneficiaries is that our safeguarding work absolutely ramped up, and we had a cohort of about 6 beneficiaries who had elevating risk, and we took the decision that actually this goes above and beyond navigation or any kind of CTI intervention, and this is around ramping up our work towards the end of closure and being relentless with what that safeguarding offer could look like. So that was working with local teams across Newcastle and Gateshead who were sitting in the local authorities. So you have the MARC team in Gateshead, or you'd have the safeguarding board in Newcastle, and talking through what that safeguarding need was and making sure that our service users who needed that extra support were absolutely plugged in to the services that were needed post Fulfilling Lives March 2020. And I think, you know, what also helped in that intensity of our work towards closure was that we had regular case management meetings. Now that went a wee bit off a little bit awry when we had a change of people who would look after the case management, because our operational lead left 6 months into programme ending, and then we had a programme manager that left a wee bit earlier than anticipated, but we had a contingency plan. So we had a system change lead, myself and Anne would start looking after what that case management looked like and be quite curious with the questions we were asking our system change practitioners to ensure that we were monitoring caseload complexity. So they're really our thoughts and feedback and some of our learning from Newcastle and Gateshead, and we're now into month 5 of closing down our beneficiary work, and it's been quite neat up until this point, and we've had a few other services come back up and say, could you sort of guide us around this? But up until this point, it's been quite a secure closing. It was hard. It was challenging. We had a lot of things to work through, as identified in this first part of the presentation, but we did it, and we did it as well as we could, knowing that we were maintaining the quality of the programme at that time. So thanks very much. I'll pass you on to Anne. She's going to talk to you about CTI.
Thanks, George. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fab. Thanks, everyone. Claude, if you could move my slides along for me, please, I'd be really grateful. Lovely, thank you. So I'm Ange Broadbridge. I'm Research and Evaluation Lead at Fulfilling Lives Newcastle Gateshead. And today I'm going to be talking you through our findings from our CTI pilot. I'm going to talk a bit about the tools that we use to explore the effectiveness of the approach. I'll say a bit about what we found, and then there'll be an opportunity for some questions at the end. But by way of background, Our critical time intervention pilot was an approach that we really used to manage a portion of our caseload, as Claude said there, in our final 2 years of client-facing work. It's a US model. It's a time-limited 9-month intervention that really comes into play as a person's making a transition and focuses on setting some person-centred goals, building a person support network for move on. And the approach happens in 3 phases, each with a decreasing intensity of support. It uses some of the principles of navigation and some of the more traditional case management approaches for those of you who don't use a navigation approach, like things like small caseloads. But it differs in some principles, like being time limited and not being there to work on everything with the person, but being there to work on between 1 and 3 really quite discrete goals. So June 2018 to March 2020, we piloted this critical time intervention model in the Newcastle Gateshead area. And it was one of the first full-scale pilots of CTI in the UK. And our primary reason for trialling this approach was twofold, really, to respond to a plateau that we'd identified in people's progress through our existing case management model, which was an open-ended navigation model, as Claude said, and to prevent a cliff edge when our frontline work came to an end at the end of March. So we moved 35 people onto the CTI pilot at the point at which they underwent a transition. And we only moved people across when we were judging that the approach would be appropriate for them. The period was 9 months, at the end of which we had the intention to bring support to a planned end. And most people were transitioning into new accommodation, so moving from the streets into supported accommodation, from supported accommodation into a tenancy. And we had 10 people who came through the process from prison. We had a few others who made different transitions, so from hospital back into the community, or we had one person who moved through to full citizenship, having had no recourse to public funds. And I'll ask you just to move my slides on. Thanks, Claude. When we were setting out plans to evaluate CTI, we had a really wide range of tools to choose from. And as most of you will know, as a Fulfilling Lives programme, we've made a commitment to using 2 tools with all of the people we support for the lifetime of our programme. And many of the people on the pilot had already worked with us through that really open-ended navigation model for many years. We already had between 3 and 5 years of new direction team assessment data and housing outcome star data. So it really made sense for us to continue using those 2 tools. But we also used some of the Fidelity assessment tools that the Centre for Advancement of CTI in the US make available to us. And I'll maybe just say a really brief word on the evaluation, because we didn't have the kind of resource that you would need, obviously, for a random control trial. That's the kind of thing that would commonly be used to evaluate this kind of intervention. And much of the evaluation was done in-house. But we felt this was okay, really, because CTI already has this really empirically supported base with reviews from other European countries, as well as the US, with a wide range of cohorts. But we did have a lot of questions about our fidelity to the model, because these clients weren't new to us. We'd worked with them for years. You know, we'd had these trusting relationships that were years old. That's just something that we needed to consider when we talked about findings. We'd also used the CACD, the Centre for the Advancement of Critical Time Intervention Fidelity Assessment tools, and we made quite a big investment of time and resource moving some of those tools onto our Inform system. And I know some of the other Fulfilling Lives areas use Inform, some others have used different client management tools. But we really felt this was time and resource well spent, because it meant that we could track across our systems. So the worker and the person would be working to develop a person-centred plan. That would help the person to move towards longer-term goals. And we'd then be able to link that to things like our personal budget. So we could support people to access some of the things that they needed to work towards a goal. And just to give you some examples there, we saw some really creative and interesting goals. We also had some that were more traditional, or were meeting kind of more basic needs, like maintaining housing through buying carpet. But we also supported some people to unlock really long-term goals, like getting a driving licence. Somebody wanted to get a passport to be able to visit their family overseas. Someone wanted to learn to play the guitar. And we had a couple of people who were interested in taking cookery lessons. And a really nice kind of closure at the end of phase 3 for somebody is that one person went on to cook a meal for their worker. We saw some really nice examples of positive closure there. say a little bit about how effective we found those tools. So we found that the NDTA gave us a really solid indicator of changes in risk around the person, so the risks to themselves and the risks to others. And in phase one, where we worked really intensively with people, this linked well to our risk assessment. We began to highlight some safeguarding needs for some people, as Claude said, that perhaps had always been there, but working closer with other agencies allowed us to pull in a more multidisciplinary approach. The housing outcome star will be well known to you. It's a theory of change-based tools. So there's this idea that people move towards independence and self-determination, and in some cases, we could link the goals to an area of assessment to be able to track their progress. And the Fidelity tools we found really helped to keep the team on track. So we used the CTI Fidelity tools and found that we dotted between kind of being fairly well implemented around a CTI model and adequately implemented. And then we could explore what we needed to do as a team to maintain and, where possible, to increase fidelity to the model. And these tools also really helped us to explore crossover with the navigation model. And although we weren't using that as a control group, the navigation group was very different. It was useful to explore differences in progress, even just anecdotally, in our case management meetings. We found that there was a very clear gap in assessing the strengths of people's social networks and support networks. I think this is really one of my personal programme recommendations, that we explore how best to measure this. How do we measure people's support networks and social networks and the strength of those? But we did progress some really interesting work with experts by experience, which you can read in our interim report if that's of interest, where they told us about how their relationships have changed over time, before, during and in life and recovery. So I'd encourage you to have a bit of a look online at our interim reports if that's of interest to you. And we came across a couple of sticking points. So we found that the goals that people wanted to work towards didn't always map across the measurement tools. And we also wanted to stay clear of saying to someone, you didn't achieve your goal, because if they move towards that, that was really positive. So some way of kind of tracking that, even just a small movement towards goals, would have been really helpful. And just a little word really on kind of workforce, and that with all worker or self-reported tools, there will be variances in how the tools are used. So going back to the guitar, for example, we know that the person accessed our personalisation fund to buy a guitar, but the worker didn't record what happened next. So some of these loose strands then kind of take time for our research team to tidy up, and it would just be really useful to be able to have kind of tracked those goals across time. So just thinking a little bit about the workforce, I'll start by saying we took a staff team who were recruited in a navigation role into a really different role as a CTI caseworker. And as Claude said, they all worked with navigation clients alongside their CTI clients in this pilot. And we found three key things about the workforce. So to work effectively, we found that CTI requires staff who are really skilled in coaching, advocacy, relationship building skills and trauma-informed approaches. And I think that probably sounds really obvious, but I want you to bear in mind that we worked with a team who'd come into our programme from really varied backgrounds. Some of the practice was more aligned to support work. CTI is very different. The key to CTI is in linking and not doing things for the person. So linking the person into a support network. And this was a really big culture shift for our team. And towards the end of the pilot, I think we found, as Claude said about some of the discussions that we had with our senior practitioner and in case management sessions, that we were really talking a lot more about making the case for curiosity-driven practice. And the Fulfilling Lives programme, as you all know, has some really great resources around exploring skill sets and what makes a good complex needs worker. Professional curiosity is something that's still really emerging in safeguarding adult support discussions, but I think there's a real opportunity for us as a programme in learning from situations where professional curiosity hasn't been evident, because it really highlighted for us that our staff team had a very different learning style across the team, and this really played through in the practice report. And what's also needed, and again perhaps obvious, is a system that's able to take on people's support after CTI ends, and this wasn't fully present in Newcastle Gateshead. Having said this, we noted some really promising practice around working collaboratively with other agencies. And in our report, we kind of outline a set of development steps in the right direction that you might like to read a bit more about. Just ask you to move on. Thanks, Claude. So what did we find? Who was CTI appropriate for? The evidence suggests that CTI is more appropriate for some groups than others, and we found that it was particularly appropriate for men who'd attained a level of stability in their lives. So that process of setting goals helped to empower some people and really encourage them to look positively to their future. And the time limit we found brought a sense of focus for some people. But we found it was less appropriate for people experiencing crisis, and that time limit, that 9 months kind of in decreasing intensity too, could be quite anxiety provoking for some people, and it could be more difficult to engage in setting and working towards goals while people were dealing with kind of looping through repeated crises. We found that the approach didn't tend to work as well for women experiencing multiple complex needs, and we felt that they were kind of needed more intensive one-to-one support for much longer than 9 months, and access to specialist support services for women was felt to be essential. Again, that won't be new to you. That's something that the Fulfilling Lives programme have said nationally too. I did have a little bit of a look at some critical time intervention studies from other European countries, and some of the Dutch studies have particularly highlighted that programmes are less likely to be successful where access to informal as well as formal supports are limited. And some of the US and Dutch studies found that women were much worse off than men regarding their social quality factors. So things like the quality of their informal relationships, having children removed, feeling unsafe, and being involved with services during CTI programs. So within those studies, I really kind of felt that women's situation didn't improve relative to men's, particularly after things like exiting a shelter or exiting a hostel. So I think there's something for us to explore here about really improving women's social quality indicators, thinking about how we kind of close that gap. And that was outside of the remit of this study, but falls within our recommendations. And finally, we felt that CTI was not the most appropriate approach for people who find it difficult to build and maintain healthy relationships. And that could mean it's really difficult for people to build support networks, which is a really core element of this model. And that obviously then includes people with experience of complex trauma. Can you move on to the next slide for me? Thanks, Claude. Thank you. So what sits behind this? Of the 35 people, we found that 7, so 1/5, returned to navigation, our model of intensive one-to-one support due to safeguarding issues. And Claude talked through some of the challenges that we experienced earlier. Overall, though, we did see an improvement in average outcomes for people over the CTI period as measured by the NDTA. So this suggests that the pilot might have helped people to move away from risk, chaos and vulnerability. And certainly this showed in some of the qualitative research that we did. The greatest improvements during the CTI period were in risk to others, risk from others and housing. But we didn't see an improvement in average outcomes as measured by the housing outcome star. I think that's really interesting. We're not sure why this was. In part, I think it's probably explained by the star being like a theory of change type tool. So I wonder if we'd see much movement over a really short 9-month period. But we'd have expected to see some changes in things like engagement with services, for example. So I think that's something to note as interesting. But overall, we seem to have had people moving from chaos and risk, not necessarily towards greater self-determination. I think having said that, I don't want to detract from some of the progress that people made towards their goals. So some people experienced really positive outcomes like maintaining new tenancies, addressing substance misuse, managing their money better, being able to rebuild relationships with family. And we know that some of these improvements seem to have sustained, and we seem to be seeing a really long-lasting and positive impact for some people. As I said earlier, I think we concluded that there was some promising practice in working collaboratively with other agencies, but there were certainly issues and limited success in supporting people to develop their support networks. And one of the things that we found in our qualitative interview work was that, we were a relatively well-funded, relatively long-term programme within this system. And both the staff from external agencies and managers from external agencies that were interviewed in this independent evaluation said that our navigators were really valued by external agencies. We'd become a resource that they could use, these agencies have become quite dependent on us, and now we were looking for them to step up and support people into the future. And that really speaks to some of the challenges that Chris and Claude spoke about earlier. So just one final slide from me. Thanks, Claude. What did we conclude? Based on our evidence, we felt that CTI isn't recommended as a generic approach for people experiencing multiple complex needs. And I think this shows in really the polarity of the two comments that we have here from people in the evaluation. From one chap telling us that CTI was the foundation of his new life. And it's nice to be able to tell you today that, you know, we heard at the start of lockdown that this gentleman's moved on into employment now, to another person who was highly anxious about losing their worker after almost 6 years of what started out as open-ended support. We do think that the model could be usefully considered as a targeted model for a discrete group of people who meet certain criteria around stability, and certainly we found that for males particularly who had an element of stability, this seemed to have been successful. Or perhaps as the second step of a two-step model, which would begin with a first kind of phase based on a more traditional navigator approach or another well-established case management approach. And I think that is a very whistle-stop tour of our critical time intervention findings. I'm just looking at the time. I think I've gone over by a minute there, but I think we're going to move on to some question and answer.
Thanks, Ange, and thanks, Claude. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. It's Rachel from CFE. Clearly, Beth has turned temporarily into a Dalek, so I'm just going to do the talking on her behalf for a bit, and Beth's going to press the buttons, and hopefully between us we can ensure the rest of the webinar runs smoothly. Sorry if you've had some problems with sound at the start. It sounds like WebEx released an upgrade yesterday, and that seems to have had an impact on people's settings. Looks like we've got some questions for you. So Paul has asked, can you recommend some resources relating to CTI?
Yeah, I think the first kind of, can you hear me okay? Yes, the first starting point for this would be to have a look at the US website for the Centre for Advancement of Critical Time Intervention, and also just to dig down into our research report, which is available on our website, and the details are just up on the screen there. I think in this chat we also have Alex Smith from Housing First at Homeless Link, and Alex is working on some critical time intervention training too. But yeah, I think that the starting point for me would really be to start with the US website and really kind of have a look at the model. I didn't have time to show today, but there's just a really nice kind of 2 or 3 minute video that you can watch to really introduce some of the principles of critical time intervention and get thinking about it.
Thanks, Ange. Got another question from Lindsay. Are there any points of learning from using CTI that a non-CTI Fulfilling Lives project could apply to ending their work with clients?
Oh, thanks. I can see that the links have just been put up there for the critical time intervention website and for our website too. I think, as Claude sort of said, really, I think the key points here are really around safeguarding issues that really came to light. And we saw this in our navigation work too. So this is not just appropriate to talk about around CTI, that as you start to close cases and you become really intensively aware of what's happening for people and what is or isn't available in the system to pass them on to, I think that's where we really found that some safeguarding issues, again, that were perhaps always there, really started to come to the fore and meant that either people didn't meet the threshold for services that we hoped to pass people on to, or they didn't feel ready themselves to make that move on. So I think that really speaks to all of those issues about getting started with planning. One of the things we did in our case management sessions was really to dig down and look at almost on a weekly basis, talking about who have we got on caseload that we'd be really worried to close at the moment. Not in a really anxiety-provoking way, but just in that sense of, if we were to close those cases within the next couple of weeks, what work would really need to be done intensively to prepare people for that move on. Don't know if you'd add anything to that, Claude?
I think, if we're looking at the learning from the ending of our beneficiary work over to non-CTI projects. I think what you're saying there is absolutely spot on around who are we worried about closing by, for us it was by March 2020, and what do we need to put into place. And I think it's going back out into the system and having really honest, authentic discussions with key stakeholders and saying, look, this person, we're still quite worried about them, and we're going to model back to you actually what we've done so far and actually move away from a dependency on service, but maybe look at something around what else is there after fulfilling lives and being quite honest with those discussions, if that makes sense.
Thanks. We've got quite a few more questions coming in. So David from Golden Key at Bristol asks, for those who return to the navigation support, who's funding that work now? Is that something that's continuing?
Yeah, I can pick that one up. Those who returned to navigation support returned in advance of the programme frontline work coming to an end at the end of March. So they had a period of navigation when their 9 months of CTI came to an end. And I think we were just fortunate that some of those people had 4 or 5 months in the run up to March where we still had practitioners who could work with people. So it was a really intensive period of navigation towards the end. That work is now not being taken forward. We haven't secured funding for that work to continue. I guess for us, that wasn't part of the plan. The plan was for the final 2 years of the programme to really focus on the system change aspect of the work. But, you know, I think fortunately we were able to hand people back to either, you know, safeguarding support through multidisciplinary teams or back into services that were appropriate for them. And I think CTI helped with some of the groundwork for, you know, exploring those support networks and what could be available.
Thanks. Paul's asked whether CTI is particularly useful for someone looking for support through transition. Thanks to Alex for responding to that, saying yes, it is, you know, particularly useful and focuses on people going through a transition. Ariana has asked, would the CTI model support frontline workers' resilience? Should it be something that's included in frontline network training?
I think I was looking at that question when you wrote it, Ariana, and then I think there's something about if you have a team of frontline workers who have been working in a navigation model that tends to be working with people that are quite chaotic, quite vulnerable, and shifting over to quite a tight model, which CTI is. You know, we talk about fidelity to the model, so that should give you real insight. There are some checks and balances in this model that your team has to meet to make sure you're doing it well. So I think if you talk about resilience, it's about what support are you going to give your frontline workers to make that transition from a navigation model over to looking at something like CTI, because that could actually impact resilience if you're feeling a bit wobbly about delivering it. And I think there's something about how do you get your team ready to make that jump into a model that's asking for fidelity and saying, if we're going to give you that training and look at, you know, the resilience part, what do you need from us? And I think, you know, if you look at coaching tools and you look at what coaching asks you to do, that's something that you need to invest in when you're looking at the CTI model, because I think it's a big ask to maybe jump from a navigation model over to CTI without oodles of training running through that jump. And that would be part of looking at how you build resilience within that jump.
Thanks, Claude. And I think Ariana then also asks, I think less more of a comment perhaps than a question, highlighting the fact that we hear again and again about women falling through the system and from services modelled around men's needs. Who do we need to alert and how fierce do we need to be? I mean, that's certainly something that chimes with me from some of the findings from our national evaluation, that women's outcomes aren't always as positive as men's on the programme. So it's a really important point to reflect on. And Claude, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to reflect on that point. At this point, we do need to move on to our fourth and final speaker shortly. Okay, if there's nothing further to add, I mean, there might be a bit of time at the end for any questions. Equally, if you think of other questions and things you want to sort of raise with our speakers today, you can drop Beth a line and we can sort of put you in touch with the speakers. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our fourth and final speaker, Christine Grover, and she's going to talk to us about the Lead Worker Peer Mentor Service in Birmingham and their experiences of closing down the process. So, Beth, I think, has handed the control over to you, Christine.
Brilliant. Let's give this a try. Apologise in advance for any technical issue. No, I've gone back. See, started already. Yay.
I can hear you loud and clear, Christine. So
brilliant. If you do have any issues hearing me, just pop something in the chat. I'll see if there's anything I can do to try and improve that. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today and listening to me talk about the Lead Worker Peer Mentor Service and the closing down process of that. So my name is Christine, and I was a lead worker in the Lead Worker Peer Mentor Service right from the beginning until the final day of its closure. So the Lead Worker Peer Mentor Service itself was a work stream within Birmingham Changing Futures Together Fulfilling Lives programme. And the service was commissioned by BBSC and was a partnership between Cypher Fireside, which is a homelessness drop-in service in Birmingham, Birmingham Mind and Shelter. So the actual Birmingham Changing Futures Together programme is still running, but the Lead Worker Peer Mentor Service work stream ended last year in June. So today I'm going to discuss a bit more in depth about the closing down process, and hopefully it will give you guys some ideas if you're in the process of closing down all or parts of your programme yourself. I've done it again. Okay, so just an overview really what the Lead Worker Peer Mentor Service was. So in a nutshell, it was a pairing of a lead worker with a peer mentor to support a small caseload of clients who were experiencing at least 3 out of the 4 following complex needs. So that's homelessness, mental health needs, substance misuse, and offending. So we employed 12 lead workers who were professional support workers with an extensive history of working in support services. And initially, we employed 6 peer mentors who had lived experience of at least 2 out of the 4 complex needs themselves and had reached a place of stability in their life. So at the start of the service, we paired 6 peer mentors with 6 lead workers to support clients, and the other 6 lead workers were working independently with a caseload. And this was just a pilot whether it was more effective with lead workers and peer mentors working together. And unsurprisingly, the evaluation suggested that was a more effective pairing, and it led to us employing a further 4 peer mentors, and that was approximately 2 years into the 4.5-year project. So as I've just mentioned, the service was 4.5 years long. It supported 323 clients, which is well over the initial target of 156 clients, but also I think speaks to the level of the need in Birmingham. So the service itself, the model, it provided support to clients for however long they required this, and you saw clients as often as they wanted. So it really was directed by them, depending on what their needs and their circumstances were at that time. So I've mentioned that support was flexible, and that was in the sense that clients could leave and come back into the service whenever they wanted to, and there was absolutely no repercussions for that. And the client also was able to choose what their support priorities were. I'm proud to say as well that no client was ever excluded from the programme throughout the whole duration. So how we achieved this was to bring in this idea of a bespoke support package for our clients. And this essentially involved getting all the necessary services involved around the table to address the client's needs with them, and then joining up those services so you're working together collaboratively as a multi-agency team. So to do this, lead workers kind of took the initiative to organise, coordinate and lead on regular multi-agency meetings. So we could all share what support we were providing, we could plan next directions, and we could help each other to achieve the client's goals. And the systems change elements, and the overarching aim of the service wasn't only just to effectively engage and support individuals experiencing multiple disadvantage, but it was to create systems change by reducing any barriers to the client receiving the right service for them at the right time. So now to the nitty-gritty, the close down process. And how we did that. So we started probably consultation about the close down process about 2 years before close down. So that was with support from Make Every Adult Matter, who facilitated some workshops with the lead workers, the peer mentors, the team leaders, the service manager, so we could air our concerns, what we thought might come up in that close down process, and start planning for how we might address that. And so this is essentially the plan that we came up with. So regarding the clients, we informed them 12 months prior to service closure this was going to happen. And actually, for me as a lead worker at the time, I thought that would be a really difficult conversation. But it was actually a very positive one, and it gave a real opportunity to focus on what that client wanted to achieve in that time frame. And just the ability to have a very frank conversation with them and say, look, we're not going to be here in 12 months. Where do you want to be in 12 months? What can you use us for, utilize us for to achieve that aim? And in tandem with that conversation with the client, we're also informing our partner agencies and other organisations who are working with the client of our end date, so they could also start looking at planning for this. And as part of the preparation, we held regular multi-agency meetings, which we were doing anyway as part of our support model, but these increased in frequency, especially in the last 12 months. And both the client and other agencies were involved in this. So we encouraged the client to lead on identifying what areas of support were still lacking for them, and how they felt this could be improved. And then all the agencies around the table had the opportunity to discuss what options they had, what was out there, what they could personally offer, and how we could fill that gap. And it's worth noting, I think, that previously the lead workers and peer mentors would contribute heavily to that offer. So we would be offering a lot in terms of support and bridging the gap between services. But we really started to reduce this and push back on other services, encouraging them to address the gaps themselves, constantly reminding them. And that idea of being relentless, I love that, reminding them that we would be going soon, and the onus would therefore be on them to continue the work that they could see was beneficial and was effective. So that reduction in our support offer got more and more as we got towards the end of that 12 months. So I think the next key stage is probably about the 6-month mark before closure, where we had a clear idea of what support the clients might still need when our service ended. So if they were in a quite fortunate position and they had achieved a bit more stability in their lives, we started looking at referrals to alternative, albeit less intensive, community-based support services. And around the 3-month mark, we aim to stop our support completely to give the new service a chance to lead and to learn how to do that, but also to build a stronger relationship with the client and have the opportunity to do that without us kind of not interfering, but that reliance being taken away from us. And any new service that we refer to, we're invited to participate in a really robust handover process. And this was to smooth the transition. And what was involved was not only us sharing our learning about the client that we'd gathered over the years, but what works for the client, what doesn't work for the client, what's been tried before, what barriers has the client identified, what are the client's risks. And the idea was to hand all that over, make that really clear so the new service could sort of hit the ground running with them. But even though we ended our support around the 3-month mark, we didn't just disappear completely. So we were still available in the background. So if there was a breakdown in engagement with the client and the new service, we could temporarily resume support just to address that. But we were always very clear from the outset that that was a brief intervention and it wasn't something that would be continued. We weren't going to resume support as it was before. And in addition to this handover process, we also requested that partner agencies started the coordination and the leading on the multi-agency approach we'd been using. So they would decide who was going to chair the next meeting. They would organise that. They would arrange the agenda with the client. They would make sure that everyone's there, the venue. So they had a chance really to experiment with that, and any issues again that came up, they could ask us and we could address that with enough time to do so. But all of this, I suppose, it was the best case scenario for some of our clients and beneficiaries. And in some instances, there just weren't the services in existence to continue support with them. And that was really difficult. And this was particularly prevalent, I think, for me. I noticed at the time, if a client was in prison or if a client was an inpatient, and that was likely to be for quite a long time, you couldn't hand them over to a new service and you couldn't start that process. And I think mainly that's due to the reduced amount of time alternative services could provide support to people. And if they only had 6 months to work with an individual, they weren't sure if an individual was going to be in hospital for 6 months. They didn't feel that was the best use of their time to start engagement. And I completely get that, but it did leave us at the end with a handful, thankfully a small handful of cases where we couldn't identify a suitable lead agency to pick up that support. And in that case, we compiled all the information about those clients, the circumstances, and what their needs were. And we created a handover document, I suppose it's the best way to describe it, which we submitted to the local authority. And this was partly systems change, highlighting some of the barriers that were still in place to our beneficiaries receiving support. But it was also a clear, firm message to the local authority that this is something they needed to address. And finally, all our referrals to the lead worker peer mentor service stopped around the 8-month mark prior to closure. And any cases we did accept at 8 months were closely looked at to ensure that there was still an effective support package that we could offer. So if it was going to take 6 to 8 months to engage an individual, we wouldn't be the most suitable person to accept that referral. But at that point, we would start signposting to other agencies, preferably within the Birmingham Changing Futures Together No Wrong Door network, to start picking up some of those referrals. And lastly, what you see, and this is so true, isn't it? Hindsight is a wonderful thing. If we could all go back in time, so many points in our life, everything would be completely different. But in terms of learning, there was a lot of learning from closing the service, but I'm learning more now, I think, in my current role as team leader for the lead worker peer mentor continuation strategy. So this team was developed using an underspend from the lead worker peer mentor service, and its aim is to share the learning and evaluation from the service to anyone who is interested, preferably organisations within Birmingham, but it could be more national level. And the hope is that services will adopt all parts of the model to improve support provision to individuals who are still experiencing multiple disadvantage. And how we're achieving that, what we're doing at the moment, I guess, is a little bit accidental. So our original idea was that we would approach organisations within Birmingham individually with the offer that we would provide free training, we would share all our learning, we could even go and spend time with their organisations to look at how they could implement the model. But then COVID hit and everything sort of changed. So we had to look at how we could get that message out still, but without that face-to-face contact. And on the back of that, we've now developed more of a resource library for other organisations to use. And that includes a series of podcasts. We've got a series of blogs. We've developed 8 webinars. We have a monthly newsletter. We're also in the final process of developing an animation on multiple complex needs, but also the value of lived experience, and a how-to sort of recruitment guide for lead workers and peer mentors. And especially now, I think, as that work's really picking up, I've noticed that that's a really effective way to promote the model and encourage others to adopt it. But I can't help think that if this had run alongside the closure process for the lead worker peer mentor service, that the impact would have been even greater. And even maybe more services would have adopted the model before ours ended. and then we would have had an appropriate service to hand our clients over to. But this is something that Birmingham Changing Futures Together do recognise as an effective way of working going forward, and are looking to do this with some of the other work streams that will be ending soon. And in addition, I guess again in hindsight, a large closure event with local commissioners and organisations, not only to share the learning and successes of the service, but a real call to action as well for them to pick up that support, to learn from what Fulfilling Lives has taught us and what methods really work to engage and support people with multiple and complex needs, to have that. But if that was also combined, say, with the launch of any continuation work, almost as in introducing the next stage of systems change, I think that would have really kept the momentum and motivation going and appetite for that service. So that's me. I feel like I've talked myself out now, but if you are interested in any of the continuation strategy work or resources, or if you think that's something you could use yourself when you're looking at closing your programs, please feel free to do so. And I have put the link at the bottom of the screen, but I'm not entirely sure everyone can see that. So I will try and paste it in the chat function for you now. See if that works. Seems to have worked. And that's me. So thank you, everybody, for bearing with me and for taking the time to listen. I hope it helped in some way, shape or form, even if it's just inspired an idea of things that you could do yourself.
Thanks, Christine. That was great. Really useful to hear in quite a lot of detail about your process for closing down support.
Not a problem.
Looks like we've got a question from Chris. Can you say a bit more about flagging or handing clients over to the local authority? What would have been, would that have been adult social care? In Bristol, I'm not sure that there is a specific service in the council that might oversee that.
So it went to the commissioning services for support services within Birmingham. So we took it straight to the commissioners, just to really highlight what was missing and to make them reflect on maybe what they needed to commission going forward, that you had this handful of really vulnerable individuals who weren't receiving effective support and were therefore, that's going to impact their life hugely, and it's something they needed to look at.
Thanks. And Chris asks, how receptive have services been to the resources you've provided as part of the continuation strategy?
Really receptive, so a lot more receptive than I kind of thought, to be honest. So we've got quite a few services interested in adopting all of the model. There's a lot of interest in the lived experience element and employing peer mentors at every level of organisations. There's also a big push, I think, for the local authority now and Birmingham City Council to look at how they are commissioning services and whether they can commission it from the learning from the lead worker peer mentor service. So they have commissioned a lead worker role, and they're in the process of commissioning a peer mentor role and also navigator roles as well, which is something that was from the wider Birmingham Changing Futures Together programme. So that's all really positive, but I think if we'd started it earlier, we might have even got more buy-in. I think there was a slight lull between when the service ended and until this work really started picking up, and I think we might have maybe not capitalised as much in our audience in that lull.
Thanks. And several people saying how useful they found the presentation. Really like the idea of the call to action event, and it's good to hear that services and commissions have been receptive and that you've had some success with getting some of the elements of your program taken on for the future.
Thank you.
We've got a few more minutes, so if anyone else does have any further questions for Christine or for any others of our speakers today, then do pop them in the box. As I mentioned, we'll share the slides. All being well, the webinar should be recorded, and we can make that available. I think it's a sort of private YouTube channel. We can send you the link to that. So if you did miss anything at the start, you can go back and watch that at your leisure. We'll also make the various resources and links that people have posted in the chat box available to you. just checking to see if we've got any more questions coming through. Don't think so. Lots of thanks, lots of appreciation for our speakers today. So I will begin to draw the webinar to a close now. Just a final thank you to our speakers, Chris, Claude, and Christine for their presentations, and for you all contributing your questions and comments in the chat box. I hope you found it useful. If you do have a question or a thought that you've occurred to you after the end of the webinar today, then you can drop Beth a line. You can see her email address in the bottom right-hand corner of the presentation, and she can pass that on to our speakers. If you want to keep up to date with the National Evaluation of Fulfilling Lives and future webinars and other opportunities, then you can follow us on Twitter. The Twitter handle's on the screen now. Or you can sign up for our quarterly newsletter. Again, the details of that is on screen, as is the evaluation website, where we post all our resources, reports, including from all the partnerships. Looks like lots of appreciation coming in. So yeah, thank you all very much for attending, and hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks a lot, everyone.